It's late afternoon somewhere in what is now southern France, roughly 30,000 years ago. The hunt went well this morning. Unusually well, actually. And for the first time in several days, there's enough food, the weather is calm, and nobody needs to do anything urgent for the next few hours. A few people in the group are just sitting. A child is throwing a flat stone repeatedly at a muddy patch of ground, watching the pattern it makes. Two adults are doing something with a piece of antler, passing it back and forth, adding marks to it. Someone else is doing an impression of the way the group's most anxious member reacted when a fox ran through camp this morning, and three people nearby are laughing. Properly laughing, the involuntary kind that takes over the whole body. Nobody organized any of this. Nobody announced that recreation time had begun. It just happened, in the gap that opened up when survival stopped demanding everything. Now ask yourself, what was that? Was it entertainment? Play? Culture? Rest? The answer is probably all of those things simultaneously, and the fact that we want to separate them, that we feel the need to categorize which activities count as fun versus which are practical, says something revealing about how modern life has fragmented what was once a single, integrated mode of being. Because the question this video is really asking isn't just, what did ancient humans do for fun? It's asking something deeper. What is play, fundamentally, when you strip away every institution and format and platform that's been built on top of it? What's left when there's no game, no instrument, no screen, no structured activity of any kind? And the answer, which the archaeological record, the comparative primatology, and the ethnographic literature all point toward from different angles, is both simpler and stranger than most people expect. Here's the assumption the title of this video is built on, and it needs to be interrogated before we go further. The premise that there was a time before music or games existed is almost certainly false. And the reason it's almost certainly false is genuinely interesting. The oldest confirmed musical instrument in the archaeological record, a vulture bone flute from Hohlfels Cave in Germany, analyzed by Nicholas Conrad of the University of Tübingen and published in Nature in 2009, dates to at least 40,000 years ago. But Conrad himself was careful to note that the flute represents a fully developed musical tradition, not a first attempt. The skill required to bore precisely spaced holes in a hollow bone at consistent angles implies prior generations of experimentation that didn't preserve, which means music almost certainly existed long before 40,000 BCE. How long before? That's where it gets genuinely open-ended, and where the real conversation about prehistoric play begins. The first thing to understand is that play is not a human invention. It's a mammalian inheritance. Every mammal that's been studied with any rigor plays when the conditions permit. Rats generate ultrasonic vocalizations during rough-and-tumble play that functional MRI studies, published by Jake Panksepp at Washington State University over several decades of research, indicate are the neurological equivalent of laughter. Ravens in the wild perform aerial acrobatics, rolls, dives, beak-to-beak contact in flight, that serve no obvious survival function, and that researchers like Bernd Heinrich, who spent years observing raven cognition in Maine, concluded were simply play. Bottlenose dolphins create underwater bubble rings and then manipulate them with their rostrums, apparently for the satisfaction of the manipulation itself. Chimpanzees engage in extended social play that looks, in its structure, its rules, its signal vocabulary of open-mouth play faces, almost exactly like human roughhousing. What this means is that when we ask how ancient humans entertained themselves, we're not asking about a uniquely human need that required human invention. We're asking about the expression of a drive that predates the genus Homo by tens of millions of years, in a species with the cognitive capacity to elaborate that drive in ways no other animal could match. The drive was already there. The elaboration is the story. And one of the oldest forms of that elaboration is also the most underappreciated, the manipulation of objects for reasons that aren't strictly functional. Archaeologist Francesco D'Erico at the University of Bordeaux has spent years documenting what he calls non-utilitarian objects in the prehistoric record, things that were clearly made, carried, and kept by early humans without any obvious practical application. Pierced shells used as personal ornaments appear at sites in North Africa dating to 130,000 years ago, among populations of Homo sapiens. Ochre, red iron oxide, shows signs of deliberate grinding and use at South African sites like Blombo's cave going back 100,000 years or more, in contexts that suggest aesthetic rather than purely functional application. A chunk of pyrite carried 200 kilometers from its geological source and found at a Neanderthal site, with no evidence of use as a tool. What are these things? The honest answer is that we don't know exactly. They might be ornaments. They might be ritual objects. They might be things that were just aesthetically satisfying to hold and look at and carry around, in the same way some people pocket smooth stones today without being able to fully explain why. But what they tell us collectively is that the human tendency to engage with objects for non-survival reasons, to find satisfaction in the sensory and aesthetic properties of things, not just their utility, reaches back further than most people intuit. The aesthetic impulse, the pull toward things that are just pleasing or interesting independent of what they do, is ancient. It's probably the foundation of every art form that came later. Then there's social play, which is where things get both well-documented and philosophically rich. In 1964, anthropologist Richard Lee began what would become a decades-long study of the Jew/Hoansi Sand people of the Kalahari, one of the most extensively documented hunter-gatherer societies in the anthropological literature. What Lee and subsequent researchers like Megan Biesel found, when they examined how Jew/Hoansi communities actually used their time, challenged a foundational assumption of the nasty, brutish, and short model of prehistoric life. In terms of subsistence labor, hunting, gathering, processing food, adult Jew/Hoansi worked somewhere between 15 and 20 hours a week. Not per day, per week. The rest of the time was available for other things. And what filled that time? Conversation, primarily. Extended, intricate, multi-party social talk that ranged from the practical to the speculative to the outright absurd. Storytelling. The performance of personal narratives that blended fact, embellishment, and deliberate comedy in ways that the audience actively participated in, calling out, adding to, contradicting. Games that left no archaeological trace. Guessing games, hand games, games built around the social dynamics of the group itself. Dance, which among the Jew/Hoansi was embedded in healing ritual, but which also functioned as collective expression and almost certainly as fun, in the most straightforward sense of the word. Now, applying ethnographic data from present-day hunter-gatherers to populations that lived 50,000 or 100,000 years ago requires care. They're not the same thing, and treating any living group as a direct window into prehistory is a methodological error. But the underlying point holds. When the survival pressure lifted, even partially, time opened up. And what fills unstructured time in humans is a remarkably consistent set of behaviors across cultures: social play, narrative, physical movement for its own sake, and the elaboration of skill sets beyond what survival strictly requires. That last one deserves its own moment, because it's the one that connects most directly to everything that eventually becomes entertainment in the modern sense. The whole fell's flute. The ochre grinding at Blombo's. The carved Venus figurines found across a vast swathe of Upper Paleolithic Europe. The cave paintings at Chauvet and Lascaux, some of which were created in chambers so remote and difficult to access that reaching them required crawling through passages in total darkness for extended periods. These artifacts represent an investment of time and skill that goes dramatically beyond what survival required. Someone spent hours, maybe days, carving a small limestone figure with a carefully rendered face and deliberately exaggerated body proportions. Someone else went deep into a cave system where there was no practical reason to go, brought pigment and fat lamps, and painted horses and aurochs and rhinoceroses on the walls with a technical sophistication that took researchers decades to fully appreciate. Why? The ritual interpretation dominates the academic literature, and it's probably correct for at least some of these objects. But ritual and play aren't opposites. They never have been. The preparation of a healing dance among the Jew/Hoansi is also something people genuinely enjoy. The elaboration of a personal ornament that signals status is also aesthetically satisfying for the person making and wearing it. The categories bleed into each other, and trying to draw a clean line between sacred practice and fun in a prehistoric context is probably projecting a modern distinction backward onto people who wouldn't have recognized it. Before we land this plane, The title's premise deserves a direct challenge, because the most important nuance in this entire discussion is this. The question of what ancient humans did for fun before music or games existed may be answering itself in the asking. The Divj flute, a cave bear femur with four aligned holes found in Slovenia and dated to between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, remains one of the most contested objects in prehistoric archaeology. If the holes are artificial, if they were deliberately made, then the instrument may have been created by Neanderthals, not modern humans, pushing the origin of music back by tens of thousands of years and attributing it to a different species entirely. The debate over whether the holes were made by a carnivore's teeth or a tool hasn't been fully resolved. But the mere existence of the debate tells you something. The assumptions we make about when things began, music, art, symbolic behavior, play, keep getting pushed back as the evidence accumulates. The more honest framing may not be before music existed, but before the music survived. Rhythm requires no instrument. Voice requires no carving. Dance requires no technology at all. The oldest forms of music and play almost certainly left no physical trace, which means the archaeological record gives us a floor, not a ceiling. What we can find is not the beginning of these behaviors. It's just the beginning of their material expression. Come back to that afternoon in southern France. The child with the flat stone. The adults marking the antler. The involuntary laughter spreading through the group like a contagion. What's happening in that scene isn't absence of entertainment. It's entertainment in its most fundamental state, unmediated, unformatted, arising directly from the interaction between a mind with spare capacity and the immediate social and physical environment. The child isn't playing because there are no video games. The child is playing because play is what minds do when they're not occupied with something else, and that's been true for as long as minds like ours have existed. The insight this opens up about the present moment is, if anything, uncomfortable. We've built a civilization-scale apparatus, streaming platforms, games, concerts, festivals, social media, whose primary function is to fill the gaps that arise when survival stops demanding everything. And we're worse at tolerating those gaps than our ancestors were, not better. The capacity to sit with unstructured time, to let play emerge from boredom rather than importing it from outside, has atrophied in proportion to how many options we've built to avoid ever needing it. The people at Goff's Cave and at Chauvet and sitting around fires across the Pleistocene were not waiting for something to be invented. They were doing something we've largely forgotten how to do, which is just to be present in the gap and let whatever emerges from that actually emerge. If unpacking what human behavior looks like when you strip it down to first principles is the kind of rabbit hole you want to keep following, then you already know where you are. Subscribe, leave a comment with what you think the earliest form of music actually was, and check the previous video on ancient fears if you want the companion piece, because the nighttime fire circle where all of this happened connects directly to everything we covered there. The play and the fear were always in the same place, at the same time, around the same fire. That's not a coincidence. That's the whole story.